welcome to the Library Mistakes. Today we have a great pleasure to welcome Bob Traa, who has had a very long and illustrious career at the IMF, and has written a series of books. And we'll be discussing the most recent one, The Macroeconomy of the European Union, a work in progress. He's also written similar style books about the US, the Netherlands, all of which are super interesting as well. But the EU is such a strange beast, if I may say so.
A work in progress.
Exactly, a work in progress is perhaps a very kind and scientific way to put it. And we all want to know what it looks like in the next 5, 10, 15 years, if it even exists in the next 5, 10, 15 years in its current form. But anyway, so Bob will walk us through his key findings and sort of the challenges and the forks in the road that await the EU. For those that will be watching this on YouTube, if you want to be apprised of our future events, please go to our website, www.lom.lausanne.ch, and register. And all of our presentations and lectures are available there, and the catalog is there. So without further ado, I pass the floor to Bob. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Boris. It's very nice for me to be here. I have some exposure to Switzerland because I used to be the mission chief for the IMF to Switzerland. From 2005 through 2007, I believe I've been here 3 times. And then we write, as staff members, a report on the Swiss economy. This is an annual report. And I was the team leader for this effort 3 years in a row. But I spent all my time in Bern and Zurich, and I was never able to come to Geneva. So when Boris contacted me and says, would you like to come and talk about your book? I immediately said yes, because then it gave me an opportunity to see this side, the Francophone side of Switzerland. I'm Germanic myself, I'm Dutch, but I was born on the German border. So German comes easier for me than French. And the other thing I should say is you are all much more sensible than I am, because you wear shorts and a nice shirt, and it's very warm in Lausanne at this moment. So I thought I escaped the heat in Washington, D.C., because it's unbearable right now in D.C., but it's equally warm in here. And this is relevant. This is relevant because the EU is working on environmental issues, including how to pay for it. And we'll see in a minute that this is a relevant topic. And then the third one, I see that Adam Smith is looking at me constantly, so I better perform. I have a picture of Adam Smith on the wall here. But thank you to Boris and Relia for helping me out to come here, and I'm very glad to speak with you, not just to you, but we'll have some discussion, I hope. So my book, what is the background of this book? I'm a macro guy. I worked at the IMF. IMF means International Monetary Fund, but some people say what it really stands for is it's mostly fiscal. IMF, it's mostly fiscal, even though we're a monetary fund. Because fiscal policy is so dominant in many countries that this drives the economic development of the country. And in the EU, which is a very young union, we're only about 23 years underway with the euro. This is nothing. Of course, the United States is now 200 plus years underway. And the first 100 years in the US was a complete mess. So people think that the US functions relatively well and Europe is finding its way. Don't forget, they wound up with a civil war after about 65 years after starting. So it was very, very difficult for the US to get started. And it's not surprising that it's also very difficult for the European Union to organize, bringing together all these different states, because there are different preference sets in each country, there are different political traditions. This is important. So what happened in '92, there was a conference in Maastricht, a city in the south of the Netherlands, and they decided that in order for the euro that was being created to hang together technically without too much stress from pressure of fiscal policy, they needed some rules of engagement. And these rules of engagement led to two famous numbers, 3% and 60%. So they agree that if you become a member of the Eurozone, but this was also aspirational for all the EU members, that you should try to keep your deficits, your fiscal deficits, below 3% and aim to bring your debt down gradually to below 60%. And then they wrote these numbers in the treaty. Are there lawyers among us here? You're a lawyer. I'm an economist, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a bit surprised that they wrote down this number in the treaty, because treaties are very difficult to change. And once you write down a hard number, then you hang on this number. So this is very difficult to change. And they're now finding out, we're now 30 years on, the economies have changed, the population has changed, the dynamics of our societies have evolved. This is normal and this is logical. And the agreements in the Maastricht criteria and the operational control of this by the European Commission in Brussels has become so complicated that they decided, together with a change in the layout of the European Union, that it's time to review. And COVID was a huge shock. So all countries busted through their 3% limit. And then the community, the union, thought that this is the right moment to suspend, because they all needed money to fight COVID. They suspended the rules, and then we'll come back to the rules in 2024. January 1, they're supposed to go back onto the rules. So this is a good idea, because the system has become too complicated. And as the time evolved, countries were missing the Maastricht criteria, and then every time they bolted on a little band-aid or a little subterfuge, and this system became way too complicated, whereas 3 and 60 are very simple. And these are ceilings. This is important. You can be below, but the idea is not to be above. So you actually have space if you want to be below. And the other characteristic that is relevant is that the northern countries had a good cycle, and they stayed typically, many of them, below 3% and 60. And the southern countries had a hard time because they were on a different cycle, and they are, including France, that's where the south begins, they are well above 60% debt at this moment. So they are now negotiating how to reform the Maastricht criteria. And by the way, the first two countries that violated the Maastricht criteria were France and Germany. So these were the big countries that insisted on the system, and they were the first one to bust through the ceilings, and nothing happened. So if you do that, you lose your credibility. That was already a very bad start when you agree on a system of certain rules of the game, and then the two biggest, most important countries bust through it in 2003, 2004, I believe. And the reason for it is the dot-com explosion. After the roaring 90s, economies grew very quickly in the 90s, and this is based on computers coming on stream. A digital economy began working, and then it collapsed. And Germany and France got caught in the downturn, and their deficits drifted up over 3%. And they were the first ones to bust it, and no penalties. So they already began to invent, when a country didn't meet it, they began to invent special rules and special features. And then, of course, your system of rules is not really working very well. So it's a good idea to reform. What happens, I'm sitting at home in Washington, D.C. in December 23, 2001, and reading the Financial Times, and there's an op-ed by Messieurs Macron and Draghi. Draghi was then the Prime Minister of Italy, and Macron, of course, President of France. And I read the headline, and you see the headline, we need to bring debt levels down, but not through sustainable spending cuts or higher taxes. Now, as an economist, the word unsustainable, I leave that out because you never want to do things that are unsustainable. I take that for granted. So what they're basically saying is, well, we're going to want to bring the debts down, but not through spending or revenues. Well, I don't know any other way to bring deficits down than to tackle spending and revenue. So this piqued my interest. How are they going to do this? And these are heavyweights in the Eurozone, and they're also heavyweights in debt, because Italy has debt of around 140% of GDP, I think. With inflation now, they're burning off some of the debt. And France is at 114, 115. So they're way above the 60%. And these two decided to write an op-ed and launch their own proposals for reforming the Maastricht criteria. And then something odd happened. They had a accompanying paper that the technicians in the ministries had written for them. And I read this paper also. And I couldn't make heads or tails out of this paper, and I couldn't understand the op-ed either. It was very strange. It was extremely self-serving, because the solutions they proposed were very nice for France and Italy, but it basically said, well, the rest of Europe has to take care of our debts. I'm going very quick through the curve here, and it's not fair perhaps, but this is really in essence what it looked like. And then so they began by saying the system is too complex and we need to simplify it. And then when I read the technical paper, it was incredibly complex. Bifurcated primary balance targets, expenditure ceilings that would leave out certain expenditures for the young generation, because you have to, of course, be popular. So you have to say that you do this for the young generation. The upshot was that the young generation would then get extra debt, but it would be investments for the young generation. So they sold it that way. But I didn't believe a word of it. I thought this was never going to work. And it was way too it might even be more complicated, technically, than the rules that existed previously. So I couldn't figure out what was going on. And since these are important people, and they have very good economists. I know, I've worked on Europe for a long time in the IMF. I know many of the people that we are talking about and that they work with, that give them advice. So it's really surprising to me that they would say this. And nothing happened. Nobody responded to this op-ed, from what I know. There was no follow-up, no discussion. So this was, to put it very undiplomatically, this was a joke, this op-ed, unfortunately. But I couldn't let go of why they would do this. Because if politicians do things that the public perceives as not serious, you have a problem. You lose trust. And trust is the currency that you work with as a political system. If you lose trust, that is a very serious matter. So why would we have them say things in the Financial Times that are incredible and that nobody should believe this or take it seriously? This is the president of France and the prime minister of Italy, who was just the chairman of the ECB. This is in my view, this is serious stuff that people put this in the newspaper. So, and then I did what I think is kind of a Cartesian approach. Now, who would have thought that an economist would go back to René Descartes and, the discours sur la méthode? He basically explains in his famous book, René Descartes, that what you have to do is you need to strip out everything that generates doubt. If you cannot prove it, if you cannot believe it, put it aside and distill the problem down to when you have something that is hard, that is logically can be established. That's the scientific method that was basically created or set in motion by René Descartes after the Middle Ages. So I did a Cartesian exercise and I said, well, what are all the things that I can't do anything with, because it's just an opinion or a statement. And yes, these are the president of France and the prime minister of Italy, but that shouldn't influence me. And what I came down with is that at the end of the day, I think what they are saying in this op-ed is, do not ask us to meet the Maastricht criteria because we cannot do it. So we need a gimmick, France and Italy, but maybe other countries too, because Greece has difficulty meeting the Maastricht criteria. Spain is working very hard, but they also have difficulties. The Eastern countries are very new into the Euro and European Union. They tend to have lower debts because in the old Soviet Union they didn't have much debt. So I think this is what they are saying. They are saying France and Italy cannot meet the Maastricht criteria because our political systems do not allow us to find the requisite agreements to cut expenditure and raise revenues to meet the deficit and the debt criteria. Now, that's a very serious thing. And I'm sure they can't just say in the Financial Times, well, sorry, we are negotiating, but we cannot do this. But that is actually what they are saying, I think. So this is why they need gimmicks and roundabouts and special set-asides. And another thing that they proposed is, and this is why it's so self-serving and disappointing in my view, they wanted to do a Hamiltonian. Now, a Hamiltonian is, Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury in the United States when the United States was created. And there were 13 colonies that had just waged a war against King George. They all had debts, lots of debts. And there were 3 million people only in the US in those days. And they didn't have established economies. It was basically, countryside. And Alexander Hamilton was trying to figure out, well, how can we move forward? Because, Pennsylvania has X debt, and then Delaware has Y debt, and New York has Z debt, and there was all different debts, and it was a mess. And he proposed, I am the new Treasury Secretary. I will absorb all the debts from the states. I will eat it up at the federal level. I'm the Minister of Finance at the federal level. And you need to give me a tax base. So the federal government in the US has income tax for persons and for companies. That is the main source of income for the federal government. Europe, of course, doesn't have a Secretary of the Treasury. And it doesn't have a tax base because the European federal authorities cannot levy taxes on the sovereign member states of the European Union or the Eurozone. But they propose, we have all faced a common shock. This is how they sold it in this op-ed. We had the Great Recession in 2010, 2012. Then we had COVID in 2020, 2022. And then they made a table and they said, since this is a common shock, we're all affected by this. So let's shift all of these debts that countries generated during these two common shocks to the federal level. And then our debt ratio in France and Italy goes down, and then we have fiscal space and we can start spending again for the young generation. The digital economy and the green economy, and because they don't know how to finance this. They know it's coming, it's going to be expensive, but they can't get the political cohesion in their home countries to finance this with taxes. So they thought, if we shove this debt into the federal level, we get rid of it. And the federal level can refinance at the lower interest rates because the EU has AAA rating and Italy, of course, has bigger spreads, etc. So we have a little pickup of margin in our economies, and that is all very, very smart, and that's what we do. So I looked at this table and I saw the countries that had the highest issue of debt during the Great Recession and COVID. And who was in the top echelon? Oh, France and Italy, of course. There were some countries that had a reduction of debt during this. Remarkably, Ireland had a small decline in the debt ratio. Germany and the Netherlands had like 5 or 10%. These guys had like 15, 25% of GDP in debt. So it was very self-serving. They would be by far the biggest beneficiaries of doing a Hamiltonian. And they didn't really answer the question that this debt has not disappeared. It's now sitting somewhere else. And then the federal government is going to have to tax your citizens. So your citizens get no relief because whether you pay it to the French government or whether you pay it to Madame von der Leyen in Brussels and then she taxes you to amortize this debt doesn't make any difference. So this op-ed, I thought it was terrible. But, you can't just criticize when people propose things. I understand why they did it, because if the political system of France and Italy cannot meet the Maastricht criteria, that is a very serious diagnosis. And the European Union, when they renegotiate these things, better think about what they do, because if you build a system that is internally inconsistent, it's just going to break at some point, right? So that makes no sense. But the numbers are in the treaty. The 3 and the 60 are in the treaty. So in the negotiations up front, they said, we're not going to change the numbers. And that you will see in a minute. This is very important because these numbers were calibrated for an economy in 1992 that was functioning in a different way. So I thought, just criticizing this op-ed is not a good idea. You need to have a positive approach. And how do you go about analyzing what the European Union or the Eurozone could actually deliver? And how do you then bolt a fiscal system on top of that macroeconomy that is fit for purpose and for modern times? That was my idea when I started the book. And when I do a book about a country, or in this case a composite economy, which is the sum of all the 27 countries, but the book also does it for each country individually. And then if you want to check the tables, you will see that the 27 countries add up exactly to the composite economy. That is actually not so easy to do. This requires a lot of work, but I forced it to be consistent. And the data were pretty good. Eurostat has very nice data. I was able to do it. So I was glad that I could do this. That's one point. The other point is I always start with demographics, because demographics are a kind of slow-moving force in the macroeconomy, but it's extremely strong. If you have fewer people in your country, then your economy is going to slow down. If you have very massive inflow of people in your economy, then your economy is going to speed up. Since the fiscal policies are built on the speed at which your economy moves, that is relevant. So you need to investigate demographics. And then within the numbers of population, there's very important structural changes taking place also, because we're getting older on average. Fertility rates are falling, they're now below replacement. So the natural rate of population growth is negative in all of our countries. And the cohorts are shifting towards elderly people. And since we have welfare states that guarantee certain benefits, healthcare, well-being, and pensions for elderly people, you need to calculate through in your scenarios what pressure is going to come in the future. Because if you want to stick with 3 and 60, that has to be bolted in somehow. You need to be consistent. So I look at demographics. And here's the first picture of the total population that Eurostat gives us, and this is from all the demographers in the member states. And it turns out we are at the peak right now. But the EU is turning to a shrinking population. And that's critical. Because when you have a shrinking population, you also have a shrinking labor force. You might get tight labor markets that might by itself be inflationary and generate pressure. And you have a slowing economy. And I take a baseline, and this decline from the top to the bottom is about 7.25%. And I go through 2100. And why is that? I don't pretend that I know what will happen in 2100, but my grandchildren who are born now, their life expectancy goes to 2100. Since I care about them, I want to make sure that the new generation and that my horizon of my calculations covers their lifetime. If they have children, they have to hopefully do the same that I do. I am fine, even with global warming, but I'm not sure my grandchildren are going to be fine. So that worries me, and that's why I think if you do a big picture macro scenario, because this is not a forecast, this is a scenario, then you need to worry. And it's next generations, this intergenerational stresses are already building and are going to be even worse. You need to tell them something about their life expectancy, and that's 80 years, and you wind up in 2100. So this is relevant because this looks relatively modest, but actually that affects the economy in a major way. Eurostat tells us, the demographers, that if the fertility rate, which is now below replacement, sits 20, and the baseline forecast is that there is a slight recovery, because there are various theories about demographic transition. These are very interesting. I have a whole chapter on this. I was fascinated. I learned all of this stuff when I did this work. And they told us that the baseline gives you this fertility, gives you this population, and then if you take a 20% margin on the downside, then you get a dramatic decline in the population of the European Union. And that is within the cone of uncertainty. So this is important. If we allow everybody to come in, with just massive immigration, then those are the two variables that determine the size of the cone. It's fertility on the downside and its willingness to accept immigrants on the upside. And this is the high immigration scenario, and this is the low fertility scenario. So this is a big cone, but you'll see that works out okay. Now here's the growth rate of this population. So we are used to this scenario, and then we had growth rates for the real economy and new people coming into the working age group, cohorts, and people coming into the labor force, generated by this population growth on average. And the future looks like this. So my intuition tells me that the EU economy in equilibrium, this is not a disequilibrium situation, that's just fewer people. It's going to slow down. We cannot keep growing the way we've done in the past. This economy is going to slow down quite significantly, and I wanted to calculate through, find a way to model this. And this is just inputs. Now look at this. This is part A is demographics. Very fascinating. I learned, for instance, that within the European Union, it's not just people coming into the European Union from abroad, from the rest of the world. The European Union is now absorbing more people than the United States, and that's new. Because it used to be that the US was the immigration country from all over the world. Mr. Trump has stopped this. And the numbers are on trend that in the US, they were generating about 500,000 net immigrants. After Trump, it was more than 1 million before Trump, always bigger than the European Union. Now in the last 5-6 years, it has reversed. The European Union is now absorbing more than 1 million persons per year, and it's accepting more immigrants than the US. There's another correlate there, because the European Union is older. The average population is older. We are more desperate to get people in labor markets because they pay our pensions. The US is a younger country, and it has a faster growth rate in the native population, or the existing American population. So there are reasons why these things happen. But part B then is the macro framework, and the macro framework is all about how does the demographic profile translate into working age numbers of people available. Participation, how do you define a labor force? Who can participate? And this is very important because you can do gender studies, and women, of course, have come into the labor force in the last few decades in very large numbers. The participation is almost the same as men now in our countries. That's very difficult to push up even further. But governments pay attention to participation, and they do all sorts of things to try and get people in, to share the work and to lower the dependency ratios, because there are so many elderly, the baby boomers are retiring, and that's just creating this pressure. Now, this equation here, which is real GDP or Q, this is an identity, because you can scratch these two L's and then Q is Q. So this is always and everywhere, under any circumstances, true. Whether you're in a shock or whether you're in a smoothly moving economy. But this is a very helpful equation. Because what it says is that real GDP in every country is the product of two things. How many people are working, labor, or how many hours is being put into the economy, times how efficient are these people. If you take L as the number of persons, which I do in my calculations, and Q over L as average labor productivity, then of course intuition tells you that this is an identity, because it has to be that the number of persons that work times how much they produce on average will give you real GDP. And I use this equation, and I do a total differentiation, and you get a dynamic equation, growth rates. So this is extremely simple, but it's extremely hard because it's a mathematical equation. You cannot deny this equation. That's the trick behind it. And then I disaggregate the numbers from the past, which you see here, from the past to 2021, and some data start in 60 and others start in 95, so that's just the data available. And what you see here is population growth in the past, which I just showed you, is 0.4, and in the future, on average per year, it's going to be minus 0.1. The population is starting to decline. So already there, we have half a point of slowdown in the population. Then the working age population is shrinking as a total of the population because more people are shifting towards the elderly, so they become dependent in an economic sense, and they need transfers. So this works against growth also because you're losing labor. The participation rate, you see everybody is trying to push up the participation rate. The extension of pensionable age is one of these vehicles that you can use to keep people participating longer, and that drives up the participation rate. Bringing females in, bringing handicapped people. You know, in the US you have ramps everywhere now that people can get to work. This is it seems innocent, but actually this is all done not just because we are nice people and we want handicapped people in their wheelchairs to move about. No, that we want them to get into the offices and push up participation. So this is all done on purpose, and every government is doing this. Then the unemployment rate. You need to take a view on what the kind of the steady state, natural rate of unemployment is in an economy that is at rest, that is at equilibrium. And then you realize that while you have this average, this thing whips around, you know, with the cycle, the business cycle. Now in the past, in the EU 27, believe it or not, I was a bit taken aback by this number. The average unemployment rate was 9.4%. This is very high. This is very high. Now I said it's coming down because there's pressure on labor markets. And I posited, and you can change this number, and it gives you a little bit variation in long-term real potential GDP. I said, let's bring this down to 6.25 as my baseline scenario. We're not there yet, but it's right now, cyclically, it's starting to approach 6.25. So these are the input numbers, and then what do I get? The growth rate of labor that comes out of this system is 0.6 in the past, so it grew a bit faster than the population. Why? Because these were the baby boomers. They came into the labor force, and this is a huge cohort. In the future, this huge cohort is becoming elderly and needs pensions. So this benefit that we had in the past, that the labor force could grow faster than the population, is turning into the opposite, where the labor force is going to shrink relative to the population because they're all retiring. This is the aging effect. And these numbers seem small to people who are not used to working with these systems. But really, this makes a difference. You know, for 80 years, these are averages. Productivity, this is the more complicated. This is all demographics based. It's anchored in demographics. Policy can make a difference. You can encourage people to work longer. But it turns out that the marginal change that you can affect through policy on demographics is very small. Governments are trying to encourage people to have more children. This is not working. It's almost impossible to encourage people to have more children. And I have a chapter on fertility. This is also, you know, you can study, when you do research, you run into these issues and you can study all of these issues and write a book because it's so interesting. And I hope I can give you a taste of what this is like and why governments cannot induce people to have more children. I find this fascinating. Productivity is a much more complicated issue. Productivity depends on so many things. It depends on capital investments. It depends on infrastructure. It depends on the climate. But we have observed that if we look at the past, productivity grew in the EU by 0.9%. And it's a declining function. It's slowly declining. We are not right now at 0.9%. We're more like 0.7, 0.6. But I figured for the future, I don't want to crank this system down to a depressing picture. That didn't seem reasonable to me because we had some big shocks. The Great Recession was a big shock. The COVID pandemic was a big shock. In the future, there are going to be shocks again. But you know, we also have new inventions. We have artificial intelligence. We now have fusion energy. These could move the needle if they come through. We don't know this. So not knowing exactly and getting lots of criticism because I keep telling people productivity growth is declining on trend. And they tell me, no, that cannot be. We invent new stuff and we're technology optimists, you know. And I say, well, it's everywhere in all the newspapers except I can't find it in the numbers. You know, if it is relevant, I should see it in the economic data, but I can't. It just keeps very slowly grinding down. And my intuition as an economist is diminishing marginal returns. We're already quite fancy in what we can do. Now, in order to make that grow even faster, we'll continue to make progress, but to accelerate the progress, because that's what you need in order to get higher productivity growth, that seems to me to be more and more difficult if you are already at the envelope, you know, the frontier of technology as we know it. Emerging countries, they can have much faster productivity growth because they can invest in modern capital goods, solar energy and so on. They don't have legacy systems, but we have lots of legacy. So as a compromise, I said, well, I'm going to keep this the same. So we're now below. In my future, I pick it up and then I freeze it at 0.9%. I come from a Calvinist country. So what does that mean? You know the Calvinists here in Lausanne. What does that mean? That means you're very cautious. And then you celebrate if you have a little bit better result than what you expected. So in the Netherlands, what I was pumped into me in my genes is you under-promise and you over-deliver. That's the way to live. But I can tell you there are countries that I have visited that do the opposite. And they tell me, well, you're a Calvinist. We can never do this. We have to promise the people whatever, you know. And then if we under-deliver, well, then we have excuses and it's somebody else's fault. You wouldn't be able to do that in the Netherlands from a cultural point of view. So here, my culture plays, every economist, every scientist, every researcher cannot escape his own culture. You know. We will get to Daniel Kahneman in behavioral economics in a minute. You will see that this really makes a difference. So I wanted not to be biased downwards. If this were my family finances, I would keep this a bit lower and then I would celebrate if I do better, you know. This is what you do. So, but look at the difference. In the past, the average growth rate in the European Union was 1.6. In the future, from these numbers, this is a logical consequence, it's not something I drive towards or I want. Average growth is going to be 0.7. So this thing collapses by more than half. This is relevant. This is absolutely relevant because this is a big drop in potential output growth. And it's largely driven by demographics. So this is why demographics is critical, and I spend 1/3 of the book in explaining why these demographics are the way they are and where it comes from. Now the deflator, because we need nominal GDP for a fiscal system. The fiscal system runs on nominal GDP, the real economy and the welfare that your utility function drives from real GDP, but fiscal, tax revenue and expenditures lives in a nominal economy, so we need nominal GDP. In the past, the ECB delivered, and I'm extending the ECB to the EU27 because it's a dominant player, 1.7% GDP deflator inflation on average. This is entirely within the mandate of the ECB because they had close to but below 2%. To me, this is price stability. This is excellent result. Some people say, oh, they missed that target because it should be closer to 2%. You know, I don't think you can find 2 in a big economy with 500 million people. To me, this is success. In the future, I pick 2 because that has now become the official target. On average, and they changed the definition, which is not innocent, by the way. We can have another talk about the ECB and the things they are doing, which scare me to death. But I picked 2 because that is the official target and everybody needs to use that because it's still a serious target. What do you get for nominal GDP then? In the past it grew on average by 3.3. In the future it's going to grow by 2.8. This again has impact on how big your deficits can be and how much debt you can place. And we'll see in a minute how that works. But this is 0.5 percentage point less than in the past. Remember this number 3.3 because it's important. Now, my friends and colleagues in the European Commission, they are the gatekeepers for the Maastricht criteria and they talk to all the countries and they do excellent work. And they publish something very similar to what I do. Every year they have an aging report where they follow demographics, and then they have a potential output report, which is framing the macro framework, and then on top of that they bolt a fiscal program. But this is the same that I do. My 3 parts of the book are demographics, macro framework, and fiscal implications. And they calculate future potential GDP for the European Union, the EU 27, which is this line. This is their baseline. So what they're saying is, you know, there's a cone around here. It could be much higher and could be a little bit lower, but this is their baseline. This is my baseline. Now, this difference in baselines is enormous. And remember, I had a high population. I put on top of that a high participation, and I put on top of that a very low unemployment rate. So I get as many people as I can find into the labor market, which pushes GDP up, because many, many people are working. Everything is favorable, which nature never permits. I get this line. This is my absolute highest possible potential real GDP in the European Union. This is what the Commission comes up with. So I'm thinking, wow, you know, where does that, because I know them, they're not crazy. These are my colleagues. We worked in Greece together to try and solve the Greek problem. And they're all very well-trained economists. How can this be? The difference between this one and that one has major implications. And it's not at all innocent, because what happens? The European Commission approves the economic programs for all the member countries. And they give guidance. And this is the guidance. The guidance is, we're going to grow in the future along this line. This is what they are saying to the member countries. And I'm telling them, well, remember, I'm a Calvinist. I'm cautious, and then if we over-deliver, that's fine. What happens if we do it the other way around? We over-promise, and then we can't make it. What will happen to the debt ratios? The debt ratios are going to skyrocket because all these countries, they're going to say, fantastic, we're going to grow out of this problem so we can place all this debt. And this is what happens, actually. Now, and then I read Kahneman, Daniel Kahneman. Oh, and here's what the difference is. We use the same Eurostat demographic profile, so our employment numbers are the same. I backed out the 2 variables that I used, labor and productivity. The difference is entirely in productivity. So they have productivity, and this is from 2000 to 2001, 0.7 goes to 1.6, it more than doubles, 135% increase in productivity in the future. And I go up a little bit from the 0.7 that we are now to the 0.9. So my question to them is, where on earth does this number go? This is big. You know, I've been to many, many countries, and I do this analysis. And I tell the minister, if you can generate 1.5% productivity growth, you're going to be fine. It may not sound like you go very fast, but you're going to be okay. This is a good result. The European Union can't do it. They're at half in the past. And we were growing fast in the past relative to what's coming in the future. So 1.5 is good. What do? They put 1.6. This is what drives this enormous potential real GDP output growth in the European Union, according to the Commission. And I worked in Greece because I was stationed there for the IMF during the crisis. Greece loves this. Because they say, look, the Commission tells us we're going to grow like bonkers in the future. We don't have to impose austerity, cut expenditures, and raise taxes. This is just, you make that up. Because the Commission tells us this is all fine, and I tell them, well, not so fast. You know, what happens, think of it in a risk context. What happens if they have it wrong? And is there a reason why it may be wrong? Well, here's the critical assumption they make, and they write it down explicitly. I give them lots of credit for this. So the long-run projection is based on the central assumption of convergence. This is the political word of all member states towards the same value of labor productivity by the end of the horizon. They go to 2070, but that's fine. This is in the aging report. Now, this famous word convergence, this is the ultimate political word in the European Union. We all need to converge, and we're happy because we all have the same per capita income, and this is a humanitarian objective of the European Union. I share the humanitarian objective. I just caution that this is not in the can, and this is very difficult to do because the countries have different preference sets. And if you have a different preference set, your economy is going to behave differently because your labor-leisure trade-off comes out different in different countries. If I live in Greece, where it's sunny, where you meet your friends on the beach, I'm going to spend more time not working than when I'm in Sweden or the Netherlands, where it's cold in the winter and you need to prepare. And then I get uptight, like a Germanic, and you need to come on time and this kind of stuff. Well, we all live in a different Skinner box, which influences our behavior, and you get a different result. So if you just say all the countries are going to converge on the same number, you're really imposing a constraint on the system that is not natural. And I am telling them, look, this is not going to happen, I think. I hope you are right. That would be fantastic, but I don't believe it. So the system is bootstrapped. Mine is unconstrained. It's just baseline, the most likelihood baseline. What they do is they bootstrap the system. They look at the highest productivity producer and they want to bring everybody up there. So in their system, in their programming of the future, they have Greece going to productivity growth that is like 2.25. They have other countries go to 2.5 or 3% per year. And why does this work? Well, we are all in favor of convergence. So we all put money in the structural reform pot, the structural policies, and then we give this money to the countries that have lower productivity growth, and then they're going to drive up their per capita incomes. Well, I have worked in these countries. It doesn't work that way. There's a reason why they have lower productivity growth, and it's not because of a lack of money. So they are pumping, but this is politics. This is just bootstrapped through politicians that lean on the staff in the European Commission. Because if they write a baseline like I do, and I've done this in the IMF, and I got a call from the executive director of the country in charge, and he said, well, you are very pessimistic on my country, can't you? We're going to look bad. And in Brussels, this works exactly the same way. There's huge pressure on the staff to make things look rosy, because we all want the future to be nice. And that's where the optimism bias comes from. This is a formal, researched phenomenon. We all do this. And it is a source of risk, because we tend to overestimate how easy it is to get there. And then it turns out it's very, very difficult. And Daniel Kahneman, in his prospect theory, which is a whole set of books with Amos Tversky, he's a psychologist, he's not an economist. He got a Nobel Prize in economics because he figured out that many things that we actually do violate rationality principles, and the whole framework of economics is built on rationality, and it turns out we're not rational because we do things quickies and we assume things very quickly, and then we make mistakes, including in investing. Right? Loss aversion and all sorts of weird examples that he brings. It's a phenomenon if you read this book. Thinking fast and slow. We think very fast and then we make mistakes. That's system one, because this is the flight or fight system. So it's human nature. And then when you turn on system two, that consumes a lot of energy, because you have to ponder and you have to analyze and you have to think through these problems more deeply. And then you find completely different results, and your investment strategy might change if you turn on system two, because you have a much better grasp of all sorts of difficulties and things constraints that you will face. So Kahneman shows systematically in his research that we do this all the time. And optimism bias is a type of groupthink. Because we have desires and aspirations, and then in a political system, no minister runs for election by saying, well, I am very cautious, but I hope we can do a little bit better than what I say we'll do. This doesn't get you voted into office. So I'm a terrible politician, but maybe I'm a half-decent economist because I'm very cautious. So that is what Kahneman finds, and he says that this convergence is bolted into the projections of the European Commission. And that's the optimism bias. And I think this is creating a serious problem. And you'll see now that we do the fiscal that it comes back. So here we go really to the Maastricht criteria. And this is, of course, we needed all this preparatory work to understand how the Maastricht criteria really work technically and mathematically. So we have a debt ratio D, which is bonds divided by nominal GDP. B for bonds, that's debt, gross debt. And then it turns out that there's an Euler equation. Leonhard Euler, he comes from Switzerland. He's a magnificent mathematician. I think he was born in Basel. And he followed up on Newton and Leibniz, and he developed a whole series of dynamic equations through total differentiation. And these are called Euler equations, and they are widely used in physics, and we use them in economics also. And what you can show with one Euler equation is that if you take a fiscal system and you run certain deficits on average, that I call deficit, and then you have nominal GDP growth, because it comes from this, the bonds grow by the deficit, right? And the nominal GDP grows by the growth rate of nominal GDP, that's y dot. Then in the limit, if you keep these averages constant, in the limit, your debt ratio is an asymptote. It doesn't run away from you up or down. It's an asymptote. And the asymptote is defined by, you take your deficit in percent of GDP, you divide it by your nominal growth rate, and that's what the system will gravitate towards. It can take lots of years to get there, but it's mathematics. It's a law of nature. You cannot violate this. And that's really where the Maastricht criteria comes from, because we have 60% D, that's what we want as a ceiling. We have 3% deficit. That's what we want as a ceiling for the deficit. So by implication, and this is not the number in the treaty, and that's why nobody knows this, were you aware that the Maastricht criteria assume that the economies can grow by 5% in nominal terms? Does anyone here in this room, are you aware that this is a third number that nobody mentions? Well, 3 divided by 5 is 0.6. That's the 60%. So what they thought through in 92 is we need our economies to grow by 5%. Remember 92, the computers had come on stream. You had a productivity lift up of the digital, starting of the digital economy, and the economies were growing by around 3%. So that was not crazy in those days. You put 2% inflation on top of that and you have 5%. So this system was consistent. Maybe ambitious, but that's okay, but consistent in 92. Right now, it's no longer consistent because we cannot grow by 3% in real terms and 2% inflation. The 2% inflation I maintain that, but real growth, as I said, because of the demographic anchor and the slowing in productivity, I just don't think we're going to go to 5%. And there's ample evidence for this. Remember now, we go back to a few slides, I said, in the past, we grew by 3.3, not by 5. So we were already too optimistic. The optimism bias was already there in 92. So the realized is 3.26. The average deficits were 2.87. Actually, countries responded to the Maastricht criteria in the deficit. So this restrained a little bit the deficits, and they met as a union, not every country, there was a union, they met this. And then my prediction was that if I use Mr. Euler's magnificent equation, you're going to land at 88.1% of GDP, because that's 2.87 divided by 3.26. I look at Eurostat, and what's the debt ratio? 88%. That's not bad. Euler was a genius. He knew how this works. In 17 something, we are just figuring out, how this, whether this is correct. But I was stunned, and I plotted this dynamically. And within 5 years, after starting the Maastricht criteria, this formula is already giving you the right direction. It's very close, and it's in the book, so you will see. So this is pretty cool. I mean, think of it this way. If you are in a ministry or central bank or wherever, and the country runs a 2% deficit, and your nominal growth is 4%, you can tell the minister instantly what asymptotic debt ratio he's going towards. You just divide your deficit by nominal growth, and that's the number. If that's an average, in a cycle it can vary, but if you take an average of, say, 10 years, you've already got a very stable base to make that claim. And that's what I tell ministers. I say, but there's a quick way, you forget about your research department, because they come up with stuff that you will never understand. Take your deficit, divide it by nominal GDP, and be honest by what you perceive to be your potential GDP, right? Be honest. 2% inflation from the ECB, that gives you a guide for what your debt ratio in the asymptote is going to be. It works really amazingly well. So this is the past, 3.3. This is the future, because I plotted the nominal GDP growth. This dip here, again, it looks innocent because it's very small, but it's cumulative, right? This is an integral. These are the annual growth rates, so you're missing, and this is when the baby boomers are dropping out. And then the system stabilizes when we have died off, because then the population dynamics stabilize. The baby boomers is such a large cohort that they influence the dynamics of the demographic population, and they influence the dynamics of fiscal policy. And here, in this period, which is between now and 2050, we're going to have a hard time. All fiscal systems are going to be under pressure. This is my prediction. And it's already in the numbers. You can see it. And everybody's extending pension ages just to try and keep it financeable. So in the future, in my baseline, I think nominal GDP is going to grow by 2.8. The treaty has bolted in that 60% is the number, right? Because they don't want to change the number. That would mean changing the treaty, and this is very, very hard. That's why you should never write a number in a law. You write the number in the implementation regulations or in the accompanying instruments, but not in the Constitution, because you are hung on that number. I don't know why they did this, but it's there. Well, then your maximum Maastricht deficit for the Union as a whole is not 3%, but 1.7. Because this 2.8 is almost half of 5. So the 3 is way too generous. And if they stick with 3 and 60, countries that have political difficulties, such as France and Italy, they cannot get their deficits down. And they're going to have a big problem because the economy slows down and their debts just keep growing. That is the whole story behind this odd op-ed, that they need a way to get around this. That's what they're doing. So, but this, unfortunately, is mathematics. I can't change this. So how do you solve this problem? Well, here we go. There are possible ways to make Maastricht consistent. You can say, we're going to raise the debt criterion. 60 is too tight if we don't grow. If you tell us that we're going to grow by 2.8 and we want space, the 3% deficit, then my asymptote is going to go to 107% of GDP. If you're happy with that, be my guest. This is too much for me, because this is a nice number on average. But economies face shocks. And once you get a shock, it's not going to be 107, it's going to be way higher. And then you get the market turning against you, and wham, there goes your interest bill, and your deficit runs away. This is the boule de neige that you have with dynamic debt systems. So the risk, if this were a stable system, then 107 would not be a problem. But it's not a stable system. You have shocks all the time, and I don't know what they're going to be. It's Ukraine today, and it was COVID yesterday, and it was a great recession because the Americans screwed up their financial system in 2010. It's something all the time. So you need to build in shocks, and 107 is just too high as a number to be comfortable in my view. But again, cultural differences play a role. Then the French and the Italians say, well, we'll just exclude some spending from these debt ceiling categories. Well, this is just fooling yourself, of course. It's like the spending doesn't exist because we do it for the young generation. Well, they still exist, and you still need to finance them. So this is just a joke, but unfortunately, this op-ed kind of seems that this is what they want to do. We'll get there. There's some results of the negotiation so far. Another one is to do the Hamiltonian. You know, if you generate this debt, but you can then on occasion kind of shove it to Madame von der Leyen in Brussels, you get rid of this debt and you say, well, for La France, you know, we have stuck below 3%. Yes, you have shifted 30% of your debt to the European Union. This is again a joke. This is just cheating, right? So this is not a solution to the problem because the debt isn't gone away. It's somebody else's problem and they need to service it, and they're going to tax your same citizens. So this is not a solution. Now here comes a fantastic one. So I think that growth, real growth, that was assumed to be 3% in the original Maastricht criteria, and 2% inflation makes 5. Let's say we're going to 1, because we're slowing down, and potential growth is 1. What does Mr. Blanchard say? Olivier Blanchard, fabulous economist from France, a professor at MIT, and my boss in the IMF as the economic counselor, and I know him very well. He says, you know what we do? We raise the inflation target from 2 to 4, because then 1 plus 4 gets us back to 5, problem solved. Well, that's a very French way of thinking, right? Because then my Germanic character comes back and says, well, wait a minute. The difference between 4% inflation and 2% inflation, if it's stable, because the higher you go, I'm worried that it's becoming less stable. If you go from 2 to 4, that doesn't bother me. Because I have indexed instruments, I have real estate, I spend a relatively small proportion of my income on consumption. But what happens to 50% of the population that sits below median income and lives in a cash economy? Their money is burning at twice the rate in their pocket. So you get distributional problems. It's not innocent to say that my equations show me that going from 2 to 4, and you have a quadratic loss function, and he does this calculation in the presidential address to the American Economic Association, gives me just a marginal change in my outcome of my utility function. Well, Mr. Blanchard, you're forgetting there are distributional problems within this average, right? For the whole economy, it may not be a catastrophe, and I believe him that it's not a catastrophe. But you will have protests from people who are sitting on the lower end of the income distribution. Does that matter? And he says implicitly, no, it doesn't, because we levy the inflation tax. This isn't a tax. It's just a tax that's mostly paid by poor people. And then, you know, this bothers me. We shouldn't solve the problems of our intergenerational pressure by taxing poor people. You know, if you want to tax people, tax me, you know, force me to pay higher taxes, because my marginal utility of an extra dollar is much less than the marginal utility of an extra dollar for somebody who's very poor. That's why the progressive tax system exists since John Stuart Mill. So Adam Smith would be proud that I defend poor people this way. But this is the, you know, there's a lot of discussion about shifting to 4% inflation. And this is where it comes from. This is the reason why they want to do it. And it's highly debated.
But then, none of the 4 solutions is a real solution, no?
No, the real solution is cutting expenditure and raising taxes. I have no magical solution. If you have a deficit, I'm not in favor of putting even more debt on younger generations. And the reason is the following. One significant problem that we make in macroeconomics, my profession, is that we work with very incomplete balance sheets. What do I mean by that? When we issue a debt, we write it down, it's recorded. I have so many bonds we issued on the liability side that affects our net worth, right? So we have a certain net worth with so many bonds that's our debt. I'm saying not so fast. You know, feel the temperature. We have been warming up the planet. This is environmental pollution. This needs to be cleaned up. This is a debt that we have never recorded. It's in no balance sheet. My wife is from Ecuador. I go there, I analyze the economy. It's an OPEC country. They suck oil out of the ground. They spend it every year. I asked the minister, have you ever calculated how much net worth of this country you have burned up by sucking this oil out of the ground and burning it in consumption rather than on your balance sheet of the country, you have an asset that's called oil. You draw it down. What do you do with it? It disappears in consumption. You should have put in place income earning assets so that you preserve your net worth. This is again an incomplete balance sheet because nobody records the depletion of natural resources. We don't record the depletion of natural resources on the asset side. We don't record the environmental debts on the liability side. So the situation for young people is much, much worse than the debts that we, the nice clinical numbers. We have 100% of GDP. No, it's probably twice as much if you value nature. And we're going to have to go there, and this is what's going to happen, because otherwise we're going to die. It's an existential problem. So Macron and Draghi, they have in their paper, their op-ed, we need to do something for the young people. So if we spend on the environment, we don't count this. Well, this is not a solution. So the solution is cut expenditures where you can and raise the taxes where you have to. But I think our generation, the baby boomers, have benefited scandalously from all these unrecorded debts that we are kind of heaving off to my grandchildren. So I think we should pay for it. Unfortunately, the taxes have to go up, and maybe we need cuts. That is a complicated political discussion. I think being a politician is the most difficult job in the world because you have to arbitrage these problems. But as economists, we should tell the politicians, the balance sheet you're looking at is completely faulty. You miss half the action, and therefore don't mess around with debt ratios that we can calculate, because that's only a small part of your problem. So I don't see an easy way out. Now, for the consideration of the Maastricht criteria, the reform, what do? I'm saying that one size does not fit all, because all these countries in the EU20, and I calculate all of them, they all have different potential GDP. They all have different demographics. They all have different debt ratios. So to fold them in all under one number, to me, this is a problem. And it has proven to be a problem because it hasn't really worked very well. It has constrained the deficits, but then that was not related to potential GDP. Value sovereignty and then hold countries accountable. So my experience is, you go to a country where the economic crisis is very deep. And then we are the bad guys, the devil, the IMF comes and imposes conditionality. We give you money, but you have to do X, Y, and Z. And the minister immediately tells me, no, wait a minute. We are a sovereign nation. You can't impose conditionality on us. And say, well, Mr. Minister, the discussion is closed. This is fine with me. But then if you are a sovereign nation, you have gotten yourself into the situation. You solve it. Don't shift this problem to somebody else. What's happening in the EU now? We bailed out Greece, then we bailed out Italy, then we bailed out Spain. So the union is drifting towards a bailout union. Well, that's not a good idea, because politicians, they smell this immediately. And they know that if you behave strategically and you say, we can never do this, then at some point, the others are going to give you some money, or you can shift some debt to the center. Do a Hamiltonian. There's nothing innocent about what these gentlemen are writing down here. This is all friamente calculado, as they say in Spain, right? This is a cold calculation. This is strategy. They're playing games. This is game theory. So I would say hard, like a Germanic, like an average Dutchman, well, I respect your sovereignty, and if you burn your behind, you will sit on the blisters. I'm not going to sit on your blisters. There's an exception to this rule. That's a humanitarian catastrophe. If you have an act of God and Greece gets a tremendous earthquake because it sits on a fault, you need to help them. That's solidarity. But what the politicians are talking, you should follow the discussion. This is fascinating. They always cry solidarity. We have an economic crisis, so solidarity means all the other countries need to transfer money to us and then forgive our debts. That's solidarity. And I say, no, you are a sovereign country. You always claim to be a sovereign country. So assume some responsibility for your own outcomes. This is consistent behavior. Otherwise, you have it both ways. If it goes well, it's your achievement. If it goes poorly, it's somebody else's fault. I've been in meetings with finance ministers who told me, it's the Germans' fault. because our people buy all these BMWs and Mercedeses and meatless dishwashers and whatnot, and we are part of this union and we can't stop this because it's a free movement, and our kids are going to Germany and to Sweden and whatnot, and it's their fault. No, it is not their fault. You are a sovereign country. You want to be a sovereign country. You always tell us that we can't impose conditionality because you're a sovereign entity. Well, solve your problems if you're a sovereign entity. This is the logical conclusion of being a sovereign entity. But they're very scared of this argument, even though they always claim to be a sovereign country, because they know what's coming if they say we are sovereign. And together with this, you need to isolate stress in the originating country. Don't export it to the European Union. This Hamiltonian, we can't solve this problem because our political system cannot square the budget deficit, and we cannot raise revenues, and we cannot cut expenditures, because there are always parties that are complaining. And therefore, why don't we just transfer this debt to the European Union, that all the taxpayers in Europe are responsible for it? Well, it seems foolish to me. This cannot be. This is not a solution to your problem. You're not changing your behavior, which causes the problem, and you're really exporting part of your problem to others. You need to solve the banking sovereign doom loop. What is this? Deutsche Bank bought lots of Greek bonds because they had such a nice rate of return while they were still being serviced. Then they collapsed, and then suddenly Deutsche Bank would be bankrupt, and Crédit Agricole and Paribas, they would all be bankrupt instantly. So you have banking systems that are connected to the fiscal position. And look at Credit Suisse and UBS. You almost had a blow up in Europe. And then the state has to bail them out, which is the taxpayers always winds up bailing out banks. This is a free insurance policy. So there's a big problem in banking that you do not know. There is no significant solution yet for the fact that if you are a banker and you engage in risk, you get a huge bonus in the first few years that this risk is okay. And then when it goes bad, the taxpayer has to bail us out because we're systemically important. You see, this is another asymmetric problem that you have to watch out. And this happens between countries in the European Union also. That's why Italy and France would be happy to shove a bunch of their debt into Brussels. And then the final solution is if these two halves, relatively speaking, cannot square this circle, well, then maybe you need an exchange rate. There are people who say we need a southern euro and a northern euro, and then that exchange rate will equilibrate the system. The south will have a high inflation tax. That solves that problem. You go to 4%, and the north will stick to 2%, and they have a much stronger exchange rate. And then there will be trade implications. But an exchange rate is a lubricating mechanism. So this is very dramatic. And the Europeans don't want to do this because the euro is a political project also. My concern is, by the way, Monet said that the euro will grow through crises. That's, by definition, a reactionary policy. Because you wait until a crisis comes and then you react to it. So you're always behind the curve. You would never do this in your personal life, at least not, highly educated, forward-looking people. They anticipate problems and then make sure that the damage is as small as possible. So, by bailing out these countries, because we had notionally no bailout clause, but that bailout clause went out the window as soon as Italy came under pressure after Greece. And then he started bailing out everybody. So, by doing this, the EU may be drifting to the lowest common denominator. It's the worst performing country that's going to determine how the institutions function. And that is certainly a possibility, but I'm not sure that that's optimizing the institutions of the Union in any economic way. So I worry about that, and I explain in the book why I think there is a tendency that if you have reactive policies rather than forward-looking proactive policies, that you are not going to get a stable union, because you are drifting to the lowest common denominator and everybody is engaged in a game to hive off, if you have a crisis, the problem of your crisis to the other members, and you call that solidarity. is, of course, not solidarity, right? This is free riding. And there's a moral hazard of free riding is in any union, any country, everybody has this. I think, proposal, oh yeah, it's an update. So they have negotiated. I don't think it's going to be finished by January 1. They say it's going to be finished by January 1. They may make an announcement. I am not sure what the value of this announcement will be. They say we want a simpler framework. That's good. We want greater national ownership. I like this because this goes to sovereignty, but I would hold them to it. When I tell you you're a sovereign country, so you fix your own problems, that's a serious business. Just saying we like ownership, you know, this is another political word that sounds great, and then the tasting is always in the tasting. What is it? How do you say this? We have to see how this is going to be implemented. And they want better enforcement. This is also fantastic. Because better enforcement means we, as a European Commission, want more power. It's a golden rule of bureaucracies. It works in the IMF, the World Bank, your national government, the cantonal government. If there is a vacuum and decisions need to be made, the one who holds the pen will write in the proposed solution that they become more powerful, they decide how things work. The Germans are petrified by this because they don't trust the European Commission. They think it's too political and they're not courageous enough to tell countries that the numbers just don't add up. You know, this optimism bias is a very serious accusation. It's not an accusation, it's a diagnostic of a problem that we all have, but you need to be aware of it. I think that by pitching potential growth in the EU so rich that countries like Greece and Italy, they will say, wonderful, everybody approves this, so we can issue more debt because we're going to grow out of it. And I'm saying, no, you're not going to grow out of it because your nominal GDP growth is going to be disappointing. And you wind up with the same problem we have now. National plans anchored in a common EU framework, so the 3 and 60 stay. They need to make national medium-term fiscal and structural plans. The structural part, of course, is because you want productivity to go up. You need that in order to grow faster. You differentiate by debt position, it's more risk-based. I think this is a positive thought. Everything depends on how it's implemented. Focus on net primary expenditure. This gives me the willies because they're leaving out something. So I never like this when they start leaving out stuff, because then suddenly everything becomes part of what you leave out. You know, numbers are fungible. If you capture the whole, then you're safer, because it doesn't matter how they classify within the whole. If you leave things out, all of a sudden these streams that go out become bigger and bigger over time. It's like off-budget vehicles, you know, they come bigger all the time. Enhance the role of national fiscal councils. This is good because you need checks and balances within the country. Then the speed of adjustment is a very painful issue because some countries are so high they cannot come down to 60 quickly. So there's a tremendous battle going on over how fast this is. And they say, in principle, 4 years and possibly 7 years if that is higher than 60%. So I did an asymptotic equation for Greece, which started at close to 200% of GDP. Guess how long it would take Greece if they run pristine policies and peg their deficit at 3% a year and they grow at 5% a year. How long does it take to get to 60? Just take a guess. Sorry? 90 years. It takes 90 years. So the Germans, you know, they're angry because they want it faster. It's not possible. You know, it's just not realistic. Deficit reduction at least 0.5% a year. I think this is a better rule because you have a speed of adjustment per year. If you go too fast, you damage GDP and you pull GDP down, and then that doesn't help you. So if this were a hard rule, there's some economists who say this is the only rule you need. If you do this every year, you go down by 0.5%, that ratio starts turning around. And then it takes long, but that's the nature of the animal. So some of them say, if you make this hard, you have done a simplification and it's good. The EU firmly in the driver's seat to coordinate, manage and enforce surveillance. So this makes me nervous because I think they suffer serious optimism bias. This is a political project. They present a reference pass. They are then in charge of assessing these plans. They already should. Smaller fines and stronger enforcement. This is all very nice. There's nothing that prevents the EC from doing this now. So if they can do it, why didn't they do it? And possible cutoff from EU funds in non-compliance. Well, I mean, this is another horse trading exercise that sounds good on paper, but it just doesn't work in reality unless you have very hard personalities in the EU. And the EU, these are politicians. I mean, they have a difficult job and they don't do these things. So we know this. So this is far from decided, in my view. They may decide to announce something and then we'll see in the next 2-3 years what happens. But it'll be tested for sure. Because the underlying mathematical, structural issues within the Maastricht criteria that we get from Mr. Euler from Switzerland are not satisfied. And then if you don't satisfy your mathematical conditions, you are going to have stress. There is no way to avoid this. So we'll see. But that's what I could come up with, if it's of any use. I sent it to the Commission. They were very polite, sent me beautiful comments. And through the grapevine, I heard that the staff were very happy with what I said, because they said, we cannot say this. Because our bosses, they will get angry if we downgrade a country. There's enormous political pressure to paint a favorable picture. This is the optimism bias. And you don't get elected if you say it's going to be difficult and we need to cut expenditures. And so that's the reality that we have to work with. But as investors, you're forewarned now that this is not a done deal, and it doesn't solve the problems with the Maastricht criteria. I think it's the implementation is going to see what's and some countries voluntarily stay below the limits, and they are always called upon to pay the others because they're doing so well, you know. So this is perennially the adverse selection that takes place in systems like this. That's what I wanted to talk about.
Is it okay to have...
Sure.
If I may ask the first question, this entire analysis presumes that a fiscal crisis and, God forbid, a default is like the end of the world. If you get there, civilization ceases to exist, when in reality, defaults, unfortunately, they're painful, but they do happen.
Mm-hmm.
And is thinking in those terms because if, let's say, Greece did default, it would have been the first domino that would have basically
well,
leveled.
they did default, right?
But defaulted in a more explicit way,
yeah,
and brought down Deutsche Bank and other banks. Does this kill the whole project in a painful way? That's why you can't even fathom, because human nature is such that it's you get over optimistic, you overspend, and then something disciplines you, the market.
So the answer is very simple and complicated at the same time. The simple part is that nature doesn't care. If you want to default, you can default, and you get a huge shock in the economy, and that will solve the problem. And that's why it's called default, because it's the end of the line. When there's no other option, the default option is to default. And that will do the job, because nature doesn't permit at the end of when the clock runs out, all the equations are going to add up. So you just wipe out a whole bunch of value, and then who pays? Well, the asset holders. You get a huge transfer of wealth. The whole concept behind management is to do this in an orderly way, so that everybody is on board And that's the issue of optimizing utility. Because many people get angry when you default on them. They cannot prevent it. Because you cannot prevent nature from closing the equation at the end of the day. So that is the default option. If we fail completely, that's what's going to happen. Nature will carry on. She doesn't care. It's like global warming, you know. They asked Edward Wilson. Have you ever heard of him? Edward Wilson is called the Darwin of modern times. He passed away. He was 90-some. Professor of biology in Harvard. And he has this concept of half Earth. He thinks we should set aside half the planet for nature to regenerate itself, because we're killing ourselves. So a journalist walks up to him and he says, "Oh, Mr. Wilson, you're a famous professor. You write these books and whatnot in the Darwin of modern days. And are you worried mankind is going to die and raise?" "No," he says, no, sorry. He asked him, "Are you worried that we are destroying nature and that nature is going to die?" He said, "No, nature will carry on. She doesn't care. We are going to die. I'm worried about the people in nature, not nature." So the economies will march on, but you get a huge shock in which lots of savers lose their livelihood, and you have abject poverty. And this disturbance is what you try to prevent by decent policy. So it's all in the nature of how do we optimize a utility function, which is the definition of economics. You allocate resources to optimize a utility function. So it's a failure of policy if you let the default option become your solution. But, you know, countries will move on. And they even go back to the capital markets fairly quickly after they default. It's remarkable.
And then, if I could ask a quick follow-up.
Yeah?
It's a completely different viewpoint. A lot of central banks have purchased a lot of government bonds over the years. And yes, there are occasional quantitative tightening exercises where those holdings decline, but generally it's been on an uptrend. And some people say that it's probably not fair to view these holdings as as outstanding debt because they don't really pay interest.
It's insider money, yeah. Of course.
Is this another potential gimmick to one day say that? Well,
no, this is part of monetary policy because the central bank issued a liability. It's called currency. Mm-hmm. It's just that the currency doesn't have interest. So they made the debt cheaper by issuing currency. The problem with that is you get inflation and you have an inflation tax, which is then has distributional consequences. So this is monetary policy. This is a different aspect of the whole picture. And it could also be very disturbing, and particularly if you have variability and volatility in rates and so on, because you have massive valuation shifts on balance sheets. So you want to keep your monetary policy framework as stable as possible, which Switzerland is one of the examples that has some success in doing this. And it gives you a strong currency, which some countries are afraid of, because then they think they can't export. So it's part of a general equilibrium system.
So it can only be used as as you say, as a band-aid, but not as it won't be used by politicians ultimately as a way to reset the system,
I'm sure
if you
will. No, they're already proposing to go to 4% inflation. That means they buy more bonds and they issue more currency.
No, I meant by sort of saying that the debt that the central bank owns is not really debt, so let's exclude it from the ratios.
Well, in some countries, the central bank is a private entity. And in other countries, the central bank is part of the public sector. If you consolidate, then the bonds that are held by the central bank are not counted as part of the outside debt. The Federal Reserve has part of this. The Social Security system has a lot of government paper, and that's also netted out. So if you do gross accounting, which is very interesting, and I've done exercises, the debts are much higher than what's reported. There's another problem in Europe. The debt numbers reported by Eurostat is a summing up of the debts of the individual 27 member states. But now the center is issuing its own debt. So I've written to them and I said, where is this debt? It is not in the statistics. They are trying to figure out how to account for this. So the debt that you hear about is not all the debt. There's more debt. So this is another kind of... The email I got was very cheeky. They didn't really want to explain what happened there. But I think the numbers are not. And now that more is going to be done through the center, this becomes more relevant. So they're going to have to change the tables. And the French and the Italians will be happy because then they can slide more of their domestic debt to the center. You know, this pressure will just mount.
I would be super interested in finding out what your opinion is on universal basic income.
Yeah. So universal basic income is an idea that you put a true floor in society. Everybody gets a minimum. And there are many variations on this. I'm very interested in the idea. The problem is that we have so many legacy systems that already hand out benefits, that if you do a universal basic system, you have to think about what you're going to cut as a compensatory measure. So you have to do means testing, which is very difficult. This is not an easy statistical exercise. And the simulations that have been done is that the system is extraordinarily expensive right now, because everybody gets a basic income. And then it becomes part of your taxable income. But if you have a tax-free base for those that are really poor and have no income at all, they will not be taxed on it. If I get a basic income supplement, it would be taxed. But the fiscal cost is very high unless you cut, you replace Social Security and wealth and health, state health spending and other provisions, and you just radically replace it by a basic income. Then there is a floor. Nobody can fall below the floor. And then everybody is responsible for, doing better than the floor. But you're protecting people at the bottom. So that is very attractive from a humanistic point of view. Administratively, it's very complicated. And there is a variant of this, which is called the negative income tax. The problem with a negative income tax means that if you are below a certain income level, you get a tax subsidy. You don't have to pay, you get money from the tax office to lift you up to the floor. That is the same principle to protect people as the basic income. But the negative income tax is attached to working. You have to work. If you don't work, you don't have a taxable income. So this is the Milton Friedman. The conservatives like negative income taxes because they want people to work in order to get benefits. This is attached. These are Siamese twins. But these are all variations on the same theme. And the broad thought about the basic income is the Rawlsian, John Rawls, a professor of law in Chicago, wrote a book about justice. And they try to define, is the objective of your policies to maximize the average utility, or is the objective of your policies to make sure nobody falls through the cracks in the net, that you have a floor, that everybody is protected? He's in favor of this latter one. Bentham is a philosopher from England. He said you have to target the average utility, and that's a very different outcome. So there are opposing philosophies as to what is a more just system. You put a floor and you protect the poor, and then everybody else is responsible for the rest, or you go for you try to maximize the average. The distributional impacts are very different. But in practice, some cities have experimented with basic income. It has been a big success for homeless people in Oakland, in California. The mayor did this. There was a presidential candidate in 2016, Yang, who said we should give every citizen $1,000 per month. And it was prohibitively expensive. But this idea is alive. And I find the idea needs to We should try to see if we can compensate for the cost, bring the cost down by then, if everybody gets a base, you don't need special, you need to cut in special social security provisions. Otherwise, some people are double dipping and that would not be right.
So inflation should be lower than the cost of raising inflation, or inflation raising actually, should be how can I express that, should be factored in the UBI.
Well, if inflation is high, then the erosion of this basic income is fast in real terms. So you need to index it to inflation that you protect people. But in the European context, most benefit programs are indexed to wages because we are passing on productivity gains to the beneficiaries. Mrs. Thatcher switched, when she was Prime Minister, from wages to consumer price index, and within 5 years they reversed because the pensioners were quickly falling behind working people. It stretched out income distribution, became a social problem. So the United States has a system where you only get inflation, cost of living adjustment it's called. They don't pass on productivity gains. And of course the income distribution in the US is far wider than in Europe. It's a really big difference. And that's part of the reason. So you can index to inflation, but you still have to worry about... and because Europe indexes to wages, you can't grow out of a debt problem. That is another link that exists. It's very interesting parameter in your system that if you change that, there's a really big effect for fiscal sustainability. But higher inflation means you need to adjust your benefits quicker. Yeah.
So thanks. It's been a great presentation. I just wanted to sum up if I understood the framework that's been used correctly. Like debt to GDP is always like government debt. You always assume
it's the government debt that we're talking. The private sector also has a lot of debt.
Right. So you briefly brought up the point of the banking doom loop.
Yes.
And okay, well, there is lots of kind of private sector debt in the system.
Yeah.
Even if we don't account for its entirety, like there is some of the quasi-private sector debt.
Yeah.
So like banks took huge risks which they wouldn't have taken if they weren't sure they will be bailed out, or the countries or like economic sectors of certain countries will be bailed out and they will not have to write off that debt on their
moral hazard problem
balance sheet. So if we imagined a mental exercise of accounting for some of that quasi-private sector debt and incorporating the numbers, together with the reported government sector debt, wouldn't it exert a much higher productivity growth requirement? Or if you stay at the levels we are, would it just...
So what you are really talking about is we have this debt, D, and then you can ask the question, how do you find that? What is in that debt? What do we count as being in that debt? In Europe, when they set up the European System of Accounts, ESA, they decided that public enterprises were not going to be in the in the government sector. So in Europe, we account for general government, which is the federal government, the local governments, and the social security systems. But many countries have big public enterprises who do public policy, and they have public service obligations, PSOs. For instance, utilities sometimes have to sell either at a loss or at a subsidy. Well, that's actually a fiscal operation. That's called a quasi-fiscal operation. In some systems that I have worked on, they were so big that we included them in the debt. But in Europe, they have agreed to leave public enterprises out. Why? France and Germany have large public enterprises and they didn't want to be included because the politicians use them to give goodies to their friends. This is, they didn't want a disclosure. In Greece, we proposed to privatize public enterprises. There was a huge uproar. And then I said, well, they all make losses. Why are you worried about privatizing a public enterprise that makes losses? Well, the politicians were telling the managers, otherwise they would get fired, give this to the aluminum factory and give that to this village, and they were just distributing subsidies all over the map, and it was on the balance sheet of the enterprise. It doesn't show up in the budget. So they meet the Maastricht criteria. Well, they didn't meet it, but they lowered the budget deficit, but they stuck the deficit somewhere else. That's an off-balance sheet operation. And that is why public enterprises are typically not included. If you are 51% ownership plus one, Eurostat is supposed to put you in the general government. But I do not know for sure. I'm not an insider in these numbers, that this happens. But if you, in the IMF, we recommend that countries keep track not just of the registered debt of the general government, but also of contingent liabilities. And contingent liabilities can be defined in such a broad way that this becomes very difficult. For instance, a premium-free insurance policy for the entire banking system is a contingent liability, and we know they come. They cash in, and it's huge amounts, right? Because you can't let the systemic banks go bankrupt. So this happens all the time. And then the debt, whack, it goes up by 20% of GDP in one shot. And then many people are surprised, but keen economists that track these things, they will tell the government, you have to be careful because your contingent liabilities are way too high. What I am worried about in Europe right now is what I call zombie companies. The interest rates were so low that a lot of corporations were able to live because debt was so cheap. And they have absorbed a lot of debt. The banks gave them loans. Now that the economy is going to go into a more difficult phase, when does this start popping? All these zombie companies are going to go broke. And then it ricochets back into your banking system. And the ECB, as you know, this is all in the quadrant of financial stability. And the central bank and the supervisors are supposed to track this. But unfortunately, the truth is that it all winds up being fiscal at the end of the day if it goes wrong. Very little of it is private. And if you're a bank manager, you take risks, you get a huge bonus, and you take it. And then next year you go broke and you say, taxpayers, this is for you. You never claw back the bonus. In Wall Street, there's a famous saying that it says you have to immediately eat what you kill. This is a hunting phrase that comes out of the plains of Africa. If a lion catches an antelope, he needs to eat the antelope immediately, otherwise the hyenas will steal it from him. If you are a banker and you make a huge risk and there's an enormous amount of money comes in, take it immediately. You transfer it as a bonus to your private bank account, because if the bank then 2 minutes later goes bankrupt, nobody will ask for this money back. And bond traders, equity traders, if Wall Street lives off, you immediately eat what you kill. That is the phrase. Have you heard this? That is the phrase that people use. So it's, but that is all part of moral hazard. And governments should watch this. Unfortunately, the bankers finance their election campaigns. So it's all a cooked game. And, if the public is not aware of this and not alert, then you can easily get problems. And they do occur. I've seen it in many countries. But the bottom line is, the definition of debt itself is not an easy matter. You have contingent liabilities, you have quasi-fiscal operations in entities attached to the public sector that are not in the reporting perimeter. All of that happens. And in some countries it's fatal, because then they get into a crisis, not because of the government, but because around the satellite entities all go broke when there is a shock, and then it ricochets right back into into the government accounts. And then suddenly you have a crisis and everybody's asking, where did this come from? Well, if you do the analysis, you know where it comes from. So, lots of definitional issues at play also.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you, in your opinion, what are the best countries, both in Europe and worldwide, with best shape regarding demographics and productivity?
Well, you have to define what you mean by best shape regarding demographics, because I like population shrinkage. I think we are on an unsustainable path. We're destroying the planet. So I want a smaller population. I like populations falling, but I realize that economically this is a massive problem because we have this debt, and debt rests on a big nominal economy. If you have a bigger economy, you can carry more debt. If the economy shrinks, you're going to have a debt problem. So for our own survival, I want the populations to decline. And, Italy is ahead of the curve. Germany is shrinking.
I'm talking regarding the perspective of an investor. Imagine that you want to invest, regarding macroeconomics, of course.
Yeah, so you want fast-growing populations. Is that what you're saying?
Not only fast-growing, maybe, but productivity, no? Because as you mentioned at the beginning, and debt levels, of course.
I have a table on productivity in the book. You know what country has the lowest productivity growth? Italy. You know which country has the lowest labor growth? Italy. So there is no surprise that Italy is the most dangerous country in the European Union. Germany is a country that has decent productivity growth, and it is partially related to the structure of the economy. Germany has a lot of manufacturing. Manufacturing has higher productivity growth than services. You cannot compare Germany and Greece, because Greece does tourism. This is very high intensive people, service industry. You cannot have high productivity growth in tourism, but this is their comparative advantage. Germany and Sweden are manufacturing countries. They have higher productivity growth. Germany also lets in more people than any other country in the European Union. So they are still, in fact, they had a little bit population growth. Now the Ukrainians are coming in. Germany and Sweden have adopted many immigrants. In 2015, we had this big crisis with the immigrants from the Middle East, and you had the Spring Revolution, you had Afghanistan and Iraq. I think Sweden took in 1 million people, which is like 15% of the population. It's an incredible number. So Sweden gets a population benefit from this. But now Sweden has elected a right-wing government that says we have to stop immigration because socially they can't do it any further. So all of these things.
Is there any statistics that these people who are accepted by the country, they participate in the productivity growth?
Well, the whole name of the game, in my view, and I'm not a specialist, is integration policy. If you are able to integrate people, you're going to benefit. If you cannot integrate them, you're going to get stress. And some countries are better at this than others. Because some countries have a very proud history. For instance, Greece. Greece is a very proud country. Being Greek is very meaningful to Greek people. And if you're not, I live there, if you're not Greek, well then you're not Greek. Whereas, I go to Amsterdam, I just mention it because I know this. In Amsterdam, you can talk any language in the world. Nobody cares. And people come in droves, but there's a housing shortage because everybody wants to come and live in Amsterdam. That's a totally different environment. In fact, the Greeks are coming to Amsterdam. Young people from Greece come to Amsterdam. So, how countries socially and politically are able to deal with integration policy is critical whether they can support immigration. And this high scenario that has very high immigration would require that the European countries find a way to integrate all these people that want to come. And that is difficult. So there are constraints. in how many people you can absorb. The US used to be very open. This is now changing, unfortunately. It's really changing. But Sweden takes in enormous amounts of people. Austria takes in a fair amount of people. Germany is the biggest one. Italy and Spain have big inflows, but there's a conduit because they're coming from Africa and from Latin America, from the history. And then the minute they land in Spain and Italy and they get a permit, they're in the European Union and they move on. So the inflow is very big, but they all pass on to other countries. And many of them go to the center. Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, Austria, the Czech Republic. It depends a bit on the language also. Some languages are difficult. Hungarian, Finnish, Greek is a difficult language. German, many people can learn. Francophone people go to France, and France is not a big immigration country. And there are many problems in the banlieue. And you see now what's happening in French Africa. There's a lot of resentment in French Africa against France. So France is not a very open country. And the participation rate in France is disappointing. And they have a slightly higher fertility rate. France is one of the high because they have lots of medical facilities and leave policies for women. So France is a mixed country, not the fastest grower. And I think very serious political problems to control debt. And this is why they look for ways to solve it in a different way. But a little bit unfair to ask others to absorb your debt. In this, Hamilton faced a different situation, but doing a Hamiltonian in Europe is very difficult. And the Germans they know they're going to pay if that happens. So they're against it.
And what do you think regarding the euro, the future of the euro, if the inflation, continues spiking up?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question, right? Is the euro there to stay? My view is that the union is still underdeveloped. So you have a lot of benefit that you can get from integrating better in the union. And if that happens, that will be productivity enhancing. And the euro can live for a long time, even though there are internal stresses. It depends on what is constraining integration, deeper integration, is that the national leaders are very jealous of each other. They want to maintain power. And ceding somewhat more sovereignty, say in defense, or in environmental policies, or perhaps in a social security system to a center, which is what the United States has done. That is for the national presidents and prime ministers very difficult because they are all politicians. They want power. And I think that is the constraint, overcoming this. And the surveys, unfortunately, the Netherlands rejected a referendum on the European Constitution. 2 countries reject, France and the Netherlands. I was disappointed because I thought that's what we need to do if we take the union seriously. But the Netherlands voted against. So you see, even in a cooperative country like the Netherlands, lives very strong, that you don't give up too much power. They are suspicious of Brussels.
But the point is that it's not a real European Union because, for example, there is not a banking union, there is not a fiscal union, and so on. So let's say European Union is just a fallacy or an entity.
No, I remember it's 30 years old. It's a juvenile.
But as you mentioned, for example, there are really big differences between economies in the north and economies in the south. And nevertheless, on the paper, everyone, let's say, the cost of money is completely different in Sweden than in Portugal or in Italy or Spain.
And which is a good thing because there are different risks.
Yes, of course. And the key part is the bonds issues, as was mentioned before.
Yeah.
Because as soon as the central bank stop buying those government bonds, many countries are at risk of.
Well, that tells you that their fiscal policies are not calibrated correctly because you cannot count on the central bank bailing you out. That is a serious problem, but it needs time. These changes are difficult, and it is another optimism bias. We underestimate how much time it takes to fix these problems.
But if inflation continues going up, the ECB will not be able to continue buying those bonds. So that's the reason that I ask you, from your opinion, what do you think that are the probabilities that the euro breaks out?
I don't think it would be a big shock if it comes in the short run. I think they have problems to solve. But there is a lot of transfers also underway. You know, the new generation European Growth Fund, 800 billion euros, goes mostly to the southern countries. And they are benefiting tremendously. The current upswing in Greece, you know, they pumped 33 billion in Greece. For an economy the size of Greece, that's real money.
Well, but that money, you know, is not really, it's like in the US that they are spending a lot of money in the healthcare system. You know, but it's not the best in the world by far.
That's the test, always. I mean, if the country wastes the money, then there's no amount of money you can put in to keep it going. So I am glad that Greece is doing much better. My concern is that, what you say, if they do get this 30 billion, how do they spend it? That's what you have to. But you know, this is the everyday reality in every country. Every country can do better if they were more efficient, but this sets countries apart. Some countries are good at this and they learn how to do it, and others are not. But that's the reality.
Well, but as you mentioned, you know, the politicians that are making those decisions in those countries, although those decisions have consequences, there are no consequences for them.
Yeah.
Because
yeah, there are many games. Everybody plays, but they play games on all sides. The Netherlands, the Germans, the Swedes, they play their own games. Don't worry, they are a pretty good match.
But in a nutshell, do you see then that, for example, I'm not sure if you see that Southeast Asian economies are going to take over European leadership regarding economics?
Well, there are cycles. And in the past, say, 20 years, 25 years, which is a structural cycle, the North has done very well and the South has been under pressure. But this is, again, a cycle. It is entirely possible that the South at some point will have an upswing and that the North will have difficulties. Because this structural cycle in the North is now running out of steam. I mean, this is clear. Germany is slowing down significantly. They're probably going in a recession, if not already. So the relativities are changing, and this always happens. So I wouldn't be desperate on that account. But there's still a lot of fruit to be harvested by better policies. And the European leaders are aware of this. What they have to get their mind around is that this is a different distribution of power. And if they can do it, then the euro has a long way to run. As I mentioned in the beginning, the United States in the first 100 years was a mess. It was corrupt. It was a real mess. We have romantic views on how this was. It was a mess. And Europe, in comparison, has a very high-level welfare state. So we're much better off than the people in the US when they became a union in 1770. But, you need to have this perspective. There's no free lunch in any of this. I don't think the euro will fall apart soon. But I think the stresses will manifest, and then there will be crises, and then they come together and hopefully they patch it up, because there's still a lot of potential, and the demographics will make it more difficult because the population will start shrinking, and that puts enormous pressure on a social democratic system, because politicians will be forced to say, we cannot grow as fast as we did in the past, so we need to all pull together to make this work. And that's where the populism comes from, because they are free riders. They play games with the stress that is in the system. And that is why they exist and why they're successful and why some politicians exploit this. And what's underway now is the big test in the US, whether the institutions will hold. Because the US is now under severe stress. with this populist movement and the nonsense that goes, the hoaxes. Even 2 weeks ago in the debate for the Republicans for presidency, there was one candidate who said hard on TV that climate change is a hoax and the whole place is on fire, in the United States. So it's remarkable what people do. And he's popular. So there's plenty of problems to solve.
Folks, I wanted to maybe, in the interest of perhaps shift
to
a more informal way of discussing things. Well, thank you so much.
I hope it was halfway interesting. Yeah. Very good. There are copies of God's book. Anybody wants? You get a free book, so. And maybe even people want an autograph. Oh, well, I'll sign. I'm really not famous enough to want them all, but I'll do it.